Every person who has ever tried to trace their American family history has encountered it. Genealogists have a specific name for it. They call it the 1870 brick wall. You can follow a family line back through the 20th century without too much difficulty. Into the late 19th century with more effort, and then you reach the 1870s and the records thin out dramatically. Connections that should exist are missing. Names that should appear are absent. Family lines that continue backward in living memory simply stop in the documentary record. This is not the ordinary degradation of historical records over time. Older records are harder to find in general, yes, but the sharp discontinuity that happens specifically around 1870 is not explained by age alone. Before that decade, thus tracing most American family lines becomes exponentially harder regardless of how much time or research effort you invest. The drop is too steep and too sudden to be explained by the normal erosion of paper over generations. The explanation is specific, and it connects directly to everything else in this story. What changed in 1870? The 1870 census was the first American census to name all Americans. Every person living in the United States was recorded by name, including the approximately 4 million people who had been enslaved before the end of the Civil War. Before 1870, enslaved people appeared in census records only as numbers in columns. Age category, gender category, no names, no family connections, no way to trace a relationship from one census to the next. The people themselves existed. Their lives existed. Their families existed. But in the official documentary record of the United States, they were represented only as numbers in a ledger. The 1870 census changed that. It was the first attempt to create a comprehensive documentary record of the entire American population, including people whose existence had previously been recorded only as property line items. The 1880 census built further on that foundation. By the time the 1890 census was conducted, researchers had a decade of post-emancipation records to connect. The 1890 census would have served as the bridge document connecting the post-Civil War era to what came before. It would have allowed people to trace family lines through the transition period. It would have documented, in recoverable detail, the communities and relationships and economic networks that existed in the years when the old guild-based economy was being replaced by the banking system. We do not have the 1890 census. What happened to the records? A fire in 1896 damaged some of the special schedules from the 1890 census. That was genuinely accidental. Fires happened. Records were vulnerable. A much larger fire in January of 1921 at the Commerce Department building in Washington destroyed most of what remained of the 1890 census records. The surviving materials were damaged and fragmentary. Those damaged fragments sat in storage, unrestored and largely neglected, for 12 years. Then, in 1933, Congress authorized their complete and permanent destruction. One day before that congressional authorization was signed, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building in Washington. The building specifically designed to be fireproof, purpose-built to provide permanent and climate-controlled preservation for exactly this type of historical document. The building, whose entire reason for existing was to ensure that the nation's documentary heritage would not be destroyed by fires or neglect, or the casual decisions of officials who did not think the records mattered. Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census on the day that the president was laying the foundation of the institution built to prevent such destruction. I have no explanation for that timing. I can tell you only that it happened, and in that the 1890 census was the single document that would most fully have connected pre-Bank in America to post-Bank in America in the family records of every person alive today. What identity meant before and after. The 1870 census did not just change what records existed. It represented a transformation in what American identity itself meant. Before 1870, identity in America was primarily communal. You were a member of a guild, a congregation, a township, a trade network. Your economic relationships were personal. Your credit was your reputation among specific people who had known you for years. Your obligations ran to individuals who could hold you accountable face to face. Your family history was known within living memory and community record, even when no government document preserved it. After 1870, identity became documentary and individual. You were a name in a federal database. You worked for wages. You borrowed from banks. You were documented, categorized, and tracked by a system whose records extended only as far back as the government had decided to create them. The same decade that produced the national banking system, destroyed the alternative currencies, and watched company towns multiply across the country, also produced the comprehensive federal documentation of American individual identity. And the records that would have allowed people to trace their own histories across that transition, to connect who they were after the change to who they and their ancestors had been before it, were damaged, neglected for over a decade, and then permanently destroyed the day after the president started building the archive that should have protected them. What still exists? I want to be clear about something. I am not claiming that every piece of what I have described represents a coordinated conspiracy with a single author and a unified intention. History rarely works that way. Large-scale transformations in how societies organize themselves usually happen through the accumulation of many decisions made by many different people for many different reasons, whose combined effect produces something no single individual planned in full. What I am claiming is that the pattern exists, and that the pattern points consistently in one direction across multiple domains and across a single decade. But what gives me the most pause is not the historical record. It is what is still alive. The Amish communities that have been running their contribution-based economy for over a century are not a historical footnote. They are functioning communities operating right now. They are growing communities. Amish population in the United States has more than doubled since 1990. They are farming land that has stayed in families for generations. They are covering each other's medical costs without commercial insurance. They are building infrastructure without mortgages. They are educating children without student debt. And they are doing all of this without the financial products that everyone else is told are not optional. Without the institutions we are told cannot be removed from modern life, without the whole structure collapsing. The Amish did not invent their system. They preserved it. What they kept, keyed through religious conviction and remarkable persistence in the face of sustained government pressure, was a version of the same community-based economic system that the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia operated on for the first 150 years of American history. The community is the bank. The reputation of its members is the collateral. The mutual obligation of neighbors is the insurance product. The face-to-face relationship is the credit institution. It works. It is working today in Lancaster County and in Holmes County and in communities across most American states. The furniture we buy now. I keep coming back to the chair my grandmother left me, nearly 2 centuries old, still solid, still level, the joints still holding after all that time, made by someone who was almost certainly paid in provisions rather than dollars, who learned the entire craft of his trade through 7 years of apprenticeship under a master who took genuine professional responsibility for transmitting that knowledge, who probably never signed a loan application in his life because the community he worked in had developed other ways of settling obligations that did not require a bank to profit from every exchange. And I keep thinking about the furniture most of us buy now, designed from the beginning with a 5-year lifespan in mind, made by workers paid wages that do not allow them to build the kind of savings that would make them independent of their employer, purchased with credit at interest rates that every usury law from the pre-banking era would have treated as criminal, delivered to houses bought with 30-year mortgages at terms under which the bank collects more in interest over the life of the loan than the house originally cost. We call this progress. The chair sits level and says nothing. The guild system that produced that chair was not primitive. It was not inefficient in any absolute sense. It was not simply chaos that needed to be brought under rational control. It was a different system, a system organized around the idea that value should move between people in relationships of mutual knowledge and mutual accountability, rather than through institutions whose business model requires collecting a percentage of every transaction that passes through them. That system produced buildings still in use after 2.5 centuries. That system produced furniture still holding together after nearly 2 centuries. That system produced communities in which the web of obligation was strong enough that when someone needed a barn or needed to survive a hard winter, the community covered the need without any institution extracting a fee for facilitating the coverage. What replaced it produced 2,000 company towns in a single generation, workers who could not leave because they owed more than they earned, financial crises roughly every decade as debt levels outran the underlying economy, followed by contractions that destroyed the savings of ordinary people, while the institutions that had created the debt survived and issued more of it. The 5 questions. Why did the buildings constructed under the guild system last for 2 centuries, while modern construction requires constant repair and eventual replacement? The answer is in the accountability structure. The guild master could not separate his name from his work. The modern contractor can and does. Why was the Carpenters Company rulebook kept secret from Thomas Jefferson? Because it contained a proof of concept. It demonstrated that an entire major industry could operate on the basis of transparent, fair pricing with mechanisms specifically designed to prevent individual manipulation of costs. That proof was dangerous to anyone whose business model depended on the information gap between expert and client. Why did Congress authorize the destruction of the 1890 census the same day that the president laid the cornerstone for the fireproof National Archives? I do not know. What I know is that the document most capable of bridging the gap between pre-banking and post-banking America and family records was permanently destroyed at the precise moment that permanent preservation of such records became national policy. Why do the Amish have to file a federal application for permission to operate an economic system their community has used without incident for over a century? The form is IRS Form 4029, an application for exemption and a formal waiver of benefits, a request for special permission to live under arrangements that predate Social Security by generations. The fact that permission must be requested proves the old system was made legally unsustainable for everyone who was not willing to fight as persistently as the Amish fought. Why does every American family tree hit the same wall in the same decade? The same decade the banking system consolidated. The same decade comprehensive federal census records began. The same decade company towns multiplied across the country. The same decade in which the old economy was replaced and the records most capable of letting people see clearly across that divide were damaged and eventually destroyed. I do not have final answers to any of these questions. I have patterns. And the patterns, once you have seen them, refuse to go away. The chair still stands. The questions remain. Why did buildings under the guild system last centuries while bank finance construction requires constant renovation? Why was the Carpenters Company rulebook kept so secret that even Thomas Jefferson was refused a copy? Why did the government sit on damaged census records for 12 years and then authorize their permanent destruction one day before laying the cornerstone of the building built to prevent exactly that? Why do the Amish need a federal exemption form to maintain a system that worked without banks for over a century? Why does every American family tree hit a wall in the 1870s? The same decade the banking system was built. The same decade the company towns expanded. The same decade the comprehensive census began. The same decade the old economy was replaced. I do not have answers, only patterns. And once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. What the pattern tells us. I want to spend a final section being precise about what I am and what I am not claiming, because the story I have been telling is easy to misread in two opposite directions. The first misreading is to dismiss it entirely, to say that the guild economy was primitive, that currency chaos was real and dangerous, that industrialization required the concentration of labor that company towns provided, that the National Currency Act brought necessary order to a genuinely dysfunctional monetary system, and that therefore the transition from the old economy to the new one was simply the inevitable and generally beneficial march of historical progress. Anyone who finds the old system appealing is being nostalgic for a past that was also harsh, exclusionary, and limited in ways they conveniently forget. There is truth in this critique. The guild economy was genuinely not available to everyone. Women were largely excluded from formal guild membership. Enslaved people were excluded from the protections the system offered. The apprenticeship system required 7 years of labor that not everyone could access. The community credit network served community members and could be indifferent or hostile to outsiders. The old economy was better for some people than others, and the people for whom it was worst are not the ones who usually write the histories that celebrate it. I am not claiming the old economy was perfect. I am claiming it worked for many people in specific and demonstrable ways, that those ways were worth preserving, and that the replacement of the old economy was not driven primarily by the failures of the old system for those people, but rather by the advantages the new system offered to those who controlled the institutions it created. The second misreading is to conclude that there was a single coordinated plan orchestrated by specific identifiable individuals to deliberately destroy the guild economy and replace it with financial dependence, that the timing of the Homestead Act and the National Currency Act proves a conspiracy, that the destruction of the 1890 census was deliberately planned to erase evidence of what was lost, that every element of the transition was planned in advance by people who understood exactly what they were creating. History does not work this cleanly. The people who voted for the National Currency Act in 1863 were primarily trying to finance the Civil War. The people who wrote the Homestead Act were primarily trying to populate the Western territories. The people who built the first company towns were primarily trying to solve the labor concentration problem created by industrial manufacturing. Each decision made sense within the context of the immediate problem it was trying to solve. The combined effect of all these decisions was a transformation that no individual planned in full. What I am claiming is that the combined effect was nevertheless real, consistent, and consequential, and that understanding the pattern is more useful than either dismissing it or inflating it into a conspiracy. The guild economy was not primitive. It was alternative. It solved a different set of problems differently. It prioritized community accountability over institutional efficiency. It prioritized quality over volume. It prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term productivity. These were genuine values encoded in practical mechanisms that produced specific and measurable results. Those mechanisms were destroyed, not by accident, not inevitably, through specific choices that could have been made differently, and what replaced them produced specific and measurable results of a different kind, including 2,000 company towns in one generation and workers who owed more than they earned and furniture designed to fail in 5 years. The chair is still level. The questions are still there, and the pattern, once seen, does not go away. The buildings and the questions here is the final thing I want to say, and it is not a conclusion because I do not have a conclusion. It is an observation. Every building constructed by the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia during the era of the guild economy that still exists is still being used for its original purpose, or for a purpose the original builders would recognize. Independence Hall is still where people gathered to understand the founding of the nation. Carpenters Hall is still used for professional gatherings. Christ Church is still a functioning congregation. The buildings work because they were built to work, not for a decade or a century, but for as long as human beings have use for them. The company town model that replaced the guild economy produced structures of a different character. The Pullman town outside Chicago, the one the Presidential Commission called un-American, has been repurposed multiple times since the railroad car company it was built to serve collapsed. The coal towns of Kentucky and West Virginia have been in various states of abandonment and repurposing for decades as the industries they served moved on. They were built for the duration of an economic extraction, not for the permanent use of a permanent community. The difference between these two types of construction is not a matter of material quality or engineering sophistication. It is a matter of intention. One type of building was built by people who would have to answer for it in the same community for the rest of their lives. The other type was built by people who would be gone before the consequences became fully apparent. The intention came from the system. The guild system made long-horizon thinking economically rational because the craftsman's professional existence depended on his work standing up over time. The company-town system made short-horizon thinking rational because the company's profits depended on minimizing costs today, regardless of what happened next decade. Those systems are not equivalent choices with equivalent outcomes. They are different architectures of accountability producing different results over time. And the results are in the physical record. You can go to Philadelphia and see them. You can sit in a chair made in the 1840s and feel them. You can look at your IKEA bookshelf and count the years until it fails and understand them. The guild system was not the past. It was an alternative that was eliminated through specific choices made in a specific decade. And the clearest evidence that it worked is not in the historical record alone. It is in the Amish barn that a community built in a single day last spring. It is in the hospital bill that a congregation covered in a single Sunday morning. It is in the farm that has passed from parent to child for 6 generations without a mortgage that the bank would eventually own. The alternative still exists. It is still working. It was not left to compete on equal terms. And it still works anyway. That is the most important thing in this entire story. Not the guilds that were destroyed, not the currencies that were taxed out of existence, not the census records that burned and were never restored and were finally authorized for destruction the day before the fireproof archive opened. The most important thing is that the Amish are still here, still building, still covering each other, still farming without debt, still proving in the living present rather than the historical record that a different system was possible, is possible, has never stopped being possible. The chair still stands. That is the answer to every question. And once you understand what it means, you cannot unsee it.